everybody. I'm
Hello.
so sorry for checking in a couple minutes late. I just came off of a podcast, so forgive me for that.
You've been busy. I was looking at your schedule and there's so much going on.
It's crazy, but it's wonderful. It's really great
Yeah.
to
Lisa, thank you for being here. Well, let's get started. I'm so thankful for this conversation. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And a wild month for making time for this.
Yes, it is a wild month, isn't it? And thank you, Sam, and thank you, EJUSA, for helping to make it happen, make it possible. Um, you know,
Absolutely.
Yeah, Black Fortune Month. We have people reading the book and discussing the question of truth telling and reparation all over the world, actually, and that is really truly exciting. And we are really we are in the middle of a month where there's a window
Mhm.
where we can actually imagine and push and get repair and get some truth telling. We have a
Mhm.
window of opportunity. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm just so grateful for the partnership of EJUSA in this effort. You guys have really been
Absolutely.
incredible.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Well, let's dive in. So, everyone, this is my friend, Lisa Sharon Harper. So, she's a public theologian, an activist, an author. She's the founder and president of Freedom Road, a consultant group dedicated to shrinking the narrative gap. So, first, talk about what that means, shrinking the narrative gap, and then let's talk about your book.
Oh, absolutely. Well, shrinking the narrative gap is simply shrinking the distance between the stories that we tell about ourselves and who we are and how we got here. There are competing narratives in our nation and in the church about how we got to this place, how we got to January 6th, how we got to, 19 states passing 34 voter suppression laws in 2021, and many states now passing ordinances or policies that will lay the ground for voter subversion in 2022 and 2024. How did we get here? Well, narrative shrinking the narrative gap is all about recognizing the narratives that we have been told, and then seeking the truth, listening to the truth, and then telling the truth about what we've heard, and privileging, centering the voices of those to whom the oppression happened.
Mm. Lisa, I think about Brian Stevenson saying that truth and reconciliation are sequential, right? It's not just that both of those are there, but there's an order to it that's so
Yeah,
important.
yeah.
Mm.
You cannot have racial justice without knowing what happened and
Mhm.
how it happened,
It's
and you
baseline.
cannot, right? You cannot avoid it ever happening again until you know how it happened.
Well, one more thing before talking about fortune, you and I will be together at the end of this month for Advocacy Day, and we'll talk some more about that. But we didn't know it, but we were in the same place years ago in Charlottesville under intense circumstances on August 11th and
Yes,
12th in
yes.
2017. So, what was your role here and what brought you here at that time?
Well, I was in Charlottesville. I was called to Charlottesville by my friends who were the organizers of that march, of the alternative, the response to the Unite the Right rally that was supposed to be in the park there. And so I came, and I didn't really know, quite honestly, I didn't really know how very intense it was. They tried to warn me, but I didn't understand. And when
Mm,
I got there, it became very clear. And I remember when we were just lining up to go march to the park, um, I we were warned that we could die. We were warned that literally the police told us, "You're taking your life into your hands if you get on the street, and we are not going to protect you." The police said that. So I sat down and had a prayer time with God, and literally on the in the pew said, "God, what should I do? Should I go? Should I not? My mom is having back surgery soon. I mean, she's going to be depending on me. What's going to?" And I heard God say, in that still small voice, I heard, "Walk, walk forward, and I'll be with you. And pick up your cross." It was pick up your cross. And I knew what that meant. It really meant no matter what, walk, walk forward. And that day, um, excuse me, that day was it was really the day where I learned what faith is.
mm,
It really felt like, okay, I felt like I was Peter being called to walk outside of the boat, because you really don't know what's going to happen. And you
Right.
just have to trust that God has got your back and that it's going to be all right, you know? Um, and, but, you know, facing down the militia man who was
Mhm.
my opposite, we were facing each other for about 2 hours, and me singing in his face, this little light of mine for about 2 hours. Um, at one point, I was looking at him and I realized this is just a man. And he's a man holding a gun, a very big gun, AR-15, but he's still just a man. And he's made in the image of God, just like I am. And so, and I remembered, you know, the power of love is more powerful than the power of power.
Mm.
That's something I learned in my early days of working in racial reconciliation back when we called it that. And so I asked him, hey, you know, can you come here? And of course he didn't. So I just yelled it. I said, you know, I just want you to know we love you. We love you. And he did something that surprised me. He said, yeah, I know. I love you too. I was like, really? Wow. And do you know that, like, literally about 15 minutes later, he was not there anymore?
Wow.
They moved him. They moved him.
Wow.
Yeah.
Broke ranks.
So,
Wow.
yeah. Hmm.
That day, if I didn't say this before, I live in Charlottesville, Virginia, you know that, and it is a city that is still recovering from that, and still so much of what we do is in response to it. The monuments that rally ignited and gathered are gone, but yet the history that brought them there is still being told and retold, and the recovery from the history leading up to it is still happening. It is a decades and generations long process, which is what you say and is what you see in your book. So I want to shift you and talk about that. So you have written many things. My first time I heard your name was when I heard about the Very Good Gospel, one of
Oh,
your earlier
wow.
works.
Yeah.
And when I was teaching, my department chair said, Sam, this book is phenomenal and incredible. And so when I read about Fortune and I saw, oh, this is the same individual, and then you and I got to work together and become real friends. So Fortune is Lisa's book, and it came out earlier this month, and there's a whole series of events around it. But the subtitle, which we'll talk about too, is How Race Broke My Family and the World and How to Repair It All.
Hmm.
So you talk about that you spent 30 years researching 10 generations. What does that mean, or what does that entail?
Well, it started in 1991. I with a phone call with my mom, and then one of the main ways we would actually connect with each other was through researching our family history. That was kind of our way to bond, and but also it was a genuine search just to know who I am. Who am I? This African American woman. You know, one of the realities of African American life is that our lives were not well documented. In fact, if you had enslaved ancestors, those ancestors would probably be lost to history beyond the 1865 wall, like we call that, kind of the brick wall of the Civil
Mm,
War. Beyond that, you'd have to find it in wills or, you know, local documents and bills of sale, or in on the slave schedule. You wouldn't find the name, but you would find the age and the coloring, and the master's name. And so, you know, in the midst of my research, actually for Fortune, I was researching Fortune and her daughter Sarah, who I believe is my six times great grandmother. And in the course of researching them, I saw that they passed a law in Maryland, the second colony, that I'm sure was you know, copied throughout all of the colonies at that time. We are now going, at this point, they hadn't done it before, but now we are going to trace the births and deaths of all of our citizens, but we are not going to trace the births and deaths of people who are not white.
mm,
And they gave no justification except for the fact that they said it's not worth it. It's not
mm,
worth the trouble. So because they made that determination in the early 1700s, that then became the practice throughout throughout the antebellum time all the way up to the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, we became citizens, and so our births and deaths became documented through the census. But you know, you'd have to go into church records to find exact dates and things like that.
wow.
Yeah.
So I think of pilgrimages and the long history that they have within Christianity, and you talk about movement of your family. I can't remember if you mentioned in the book or not, but you, I think, moved from DC to Philadelphia, either while researching and writing the book. So were there any pilgrimages or significant moments of geography that had meaning for you that you either intentionally took during the writing of this book that influenced what happened?
Yeah, there were actually quite a few. I made a point of going to at least three of the places, four actually, the places that I speak about, in order to be able to stand on the land and feel the story, hear the story from the
Mhm.
land, listen to the story that the land tells. And one of those places was the land that Fortune lived on. Now I have to explain Fortune in order for people to understand this. Fortune was the very first American land on this soil born ancestor in my family. Her mother was an Ulster Scots woman from Belfast. Her father was from Senegal, brought over on a ship called the Speedwell, who that came and landed on American soil, on Maryland, colonial American Maryland soil in 1686. So somewhere between 1686 and 1687, didn't take very long. Maudlin and Sambo, that's his name, Sambo Game, fell in love and had a child. And it was actually an affair because Maudlin was already married.
Mm.
So a little seedy there, right? But they have a child and they named this child Fortune. Now, according to the law at the time, Fortune nor Maudlin should have been indentured for this because there was a kind of a brief respite in the law at the time in 1687. But before that, the very first race law that had been passed in the colony of Maryland declared that any white woman who married and enslaved black men, and there were many at that time, this is what prompted them to actually write the first race law in Maryland, would then become enslaved to her husband's master until her husband's death. And her children would be enslaved in perpetuity. And so that was the very first race law in the colony, the second colony, the colony of Maryland. Um, Before that, you had the first race law in Virginia, which was trying to solve the exact opposite problem,
Mhm.
mixed race children coming from the union of white men who were raping their enslaved black women. And so the question of citizenship and who gets enslaved came up there. And that's where the very first race law came from ever. It was through who is a citizen and who is protected from being enslaved. The law in Virginia said, and not just Virginia, in Maryland, in England, said that English citizens could not be enslaved and Christians could not be enslaved, and yet these white men were raping black women, and creating mixed race children who
Mhm.
then had a father who was a British citizen, and citizenship went through the line of the father in Virginia and in England. And so they just changed it. They said, okay, no longer is citizenship going to go through the line of the father. Now it's going to go through the line of the mother.
Mhm.
So that's how the very first race law was created. And her descendants will be enslaved in perpetuity. So those two words, in perpetuity, show up both in Virginia and in Maryland within 2 years of each other. And it's that law and the iterations thereof that then ensnare Fortune in
Mm.
not in slavery, but in indentured servitude. Why? Because her mother was white.
Yeah.
Because by the time she was indentured, if your mother was white, then you could not be enslaved. But if your father was black, you would definitely be indentured. And so there in those first iterations of the race laws, you actually see the explicit um, privilege of whiteness.
Right. Right. And it's so in the face of history because historically you have this lineage defined in a completely opposite way. And then the switch of this was done on purpose to secure this. And it was exceptional that slavery was now in perpetuity, that it was lifelong.
That's
That was
right.
not a common practice globally
No,
and in other cultures. And this was unique, unfortunately, here in Virginia and then cascading to other states in this country.
that's right. So
Hmm.
what you see is you actually see the invention of a permanent um, class that is believed now to be here in order to uphold white male flourishing. That's the bottom line. And it's only white women, and in so much as they protect white male flourishing. So we see in the case of Fortune and in Maryland, when white women did not protect white male flourishing, or when they chose people other, they may as well be a slave, right? They may as well have been, literally, they may as well have been black. And they became black according to the law. They were enslaved. So I think that what I have been impressed with, the thing that has kind of blown my own mind as I've done this research, is that through every generation, these laws have been passed that have crafted legal constructs and political constructs that have ensnared and exploited the labor of people of color, always for the benefit of white male bank accounts. Always. It is
Mhm.
not about hatred so much as it is about white male flourishing. And
Right.
in the white male imagination, from the very beginning of the establishment of the colonies, there has been a belief that this is a zero sum game. There has been a belief that uh, we can't all flourish, we can't all share power. There's got to be domination. And I think that what I come to at the end of the book is we have to find a new way of being together in the world. Within
Mhm.
23 years, we're going to have a nation that has no racial majority. And on top of that, people of color will be the majority altogether in the aggregate. And so, what does it mean then to be white? Because you see, up to this point, whiteness has meant power, whiteness has meant domination. But when you are no longer the majority, you cannot assume power unless you are then going to gerrymander, unless you're going to subvert the vote, and unless you're going to suppress the vote. Then what you get is you get the rule of the minority over the majority, through undemocratic means, really through authoritarianism and fascism, which is what we are moving to as a nation. Um, so the thing that has blown my mind is how my family story, I wrote it. I wrote it as a book, not just to my own just nephews and nieces, because it intersects with all of these major moments where the construct of race is formed in America,
Mhm.
and it's instructive to us now about what it looks like for us to then repair what race broke among us.
You talk about in your book asking the question, who is it that benefits from this system? And you talked about the white male benefit, and you talked about it especially being an economic benefit.
Mhm.
So you ended with what I want to ask about. I want to break your subtitle into two pieces. So
Sure.
say a little more of what you mean when you talk about how race broke the world.
Yeah. So race broke the world when in 1619, those first 20 and odd African Angolan men were deboarded off of a warship that had pirated a slave ship, a death ship, headed to Mexico to enslave African men, these Angolan men in Mexico. They were pirated off that ship and brought into the port the very first time any death ship from Africa had come into the port of this quote new world, for lack of better terminology.
Mhm.
Um, and they had a choice. John Wolfe met the ship, leader of the colony. Um, he could have said, you know what, turn back, take them back. We don't do that here. He could have said, okay, all right, we're not going to enslave these people. We're going to do just injustice light. We're going to have them do fee for service. We're not going to take them back, but we're going to give them payment for their work, right? That would have been injustice light, because real justice would mean take them back and let them live and thrive on their own land. But they didn't do any of that. Instead, what they did was they said, okay, we'll use them. And they indentured and enslaved. Some were indentured, some were enslaved. And that was the beginning. That was actually the beginning of the economic viability of the Virginia colony, the colony of Jamestown at the time.
Mhm.
It didn't take long. It was another choice that they made in 1662 when they did change how citizenship status was attained in the colony of Virginia. They could have in that moment said, we have so many mixed race kids, same in Maryland. We're just going to phase this out. We're going to phase out this slavery thing. We're going to phase out this indentured servitude thing even, and we're going to give people fee for service. We're going to actually allow a truly democratic society to develop, but they didn't. Instead, they jerry-rigged the system and they decided these law-abiding, House of Burgesses members, the members of their legislature, who love the law, simply changed the law in order to love the law. So they changed it so that the citizenship status went from the line of the father to the line of the mother in perpetuity. That's how race-based slavery was truly established on this soil.
Mhm.
They could have made a different decision, and they could have made a choice in the first Congress. They could have said, you know what, we are going to actually now do away with this slavery thing that was a part of the British colonies. It was actually a holdover from colonialism, and we're going to chart a new way of being together in the world. We're going to actually do a fee for service. We're going to allow people to go back if they want to go back, but we're also going to completely integrate people into a non-racialized society, a de-racialized society where we all get to be human. But they didn't. Instead, they passed the three-fifths compromise, where it was said that the first gerrymander, now because they did not give people of African descent the vote, but they did have a majority of Black people in the South, they would not have actually, legally, they would, just in terms of raw numbers, you wouldn't have good representation. The North would always have the advantage because there were very few white people actually in the South. So they counted Black people as three-fifths of a human being. That was the compromise. The North didn't want to count them at all. Um, and that count then gave parity to white members of Congress to have more representation than they were really worth, with the number of people who were there, and that still lasts to this day. That's what the gerrymandering is about right now. Um, they made choices toward white male economic flourishing and broke the world again after Reconstruction. Reconstruction was this period right after the Civil War where 9 years, we had 9 years of peace, 9 years of flourishing. You had 2,000 people of African descent elected into public office across the country, mostly in the South. We were lieutenant governors and judges and mayors. We were senators of the United States Senate. We were House members. We had our own incorporated towns.
Judges and
And then,
mayors.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, all of it. And
Mhm.
then that compromise was made in 1877, where the Northern Republicans compromised with the Southern Democrats because there was contention over who won that election. Remind you of anything? And they said, "Tell you what, we will take our troops out." The Northern Republicans said, "We'll take our troops out of the South if you will play nice with us and the Union. You'll actually join the Union fully." And so they did it. They said, okay. One thing I learned is that whenever you have white men compromising, the people who are compromised are people of African descent in American history. We are the ones who are compromised. Our bodies, our futures are compromised. And so what happened was the troops left and the KKK rose. And within years, you had up to 5,000 lynchings across American soil, across the continent, and not just the continent, the U.S. alone. And they the same thing for the FHA home loans. When the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority, was established in 1933, it was a segregationist that wrote the law, that wrote the algorithm that would determine how they valued land and gave loans. And that algorithm said that if even one person of African descent lived on in a community, the land value of that community immediately and automatically went down. It's not scientific. It simply was because they wrote it into the law. And so it became. So what's going to naturally happen? Community covenants, redlining is going to happen because nobody wants their property value to go down. So they legislated at every turn for white male flourishing. Finally, there was eminent domain where they claimed two different sections of my family had their land claimed by eminent domain. And so
Mm.
that's family legacy that was lost. That was college tuitions that were lost.
Mhm.
That was houses and future wealth accumulation that was
Mhm.
lost because
Mhm.
the city or the state claimed the land by eminent domain, paying only pennies on the dollar. So Hiram Lawrence, the son of Henry Lawrence, who chapter 2 is about. Hiram Lawrence owned a block of homes, a whole block of homes here in the Elmwood section of Philadelphia. He was paid pennies on the dollar for that and was only able then to buy one home for three generations of his family to share. And he died that year of a broken heart, we believe. So this has repercussions. And then finally, you have the drug wars in the 70s. Nixon deciding to launch what he called the drug wars in order to give justification. His own legislative director confessed in 1995 to give justification for going in and breaking up his political enemies, the communities of his political enemies, Black people and hippies. So by launching the drug wars, he could justify and then pumping drugs into those communities through the mafia, the police, and small time drug dealers. He could justify then going in and jailing half the community, the men. My own uncle plopped dead 1 block from here from a heroin overdose after heroin was pumped into this community that I'm sitting in right now. My grandmother, one generation later in 1993, um, was beaten to death by a crack addict in our neighborhood after crack was pumped into this neighborhood by the same means under Reagan's presidency. Why? For political power. So, and every single generation, laws were passed, policies were passed, structures were erected in order to establish, entrench, and protect white male power.
So there are these decision points I have in my mind, like a tree, like within your book of a family tree, but yet it's these decision moments of all of these intentional pieces, right? We've used words of intention, of invention, these things of someone doing something on purpose. And bit by bit, this wasn't something that happened. It was constructed and made this way. And you gave a really comprehensive history of how that was true from 1619 up through the present day. So race has broken the world, and it was done on purpose. It was not something that has been an accident. And it continues and it persists. So that's the first half of your subtitle, right? Of how race broke the world and my family. The second part is repair. And so I want to talk about, what does it look like to repair? You have a lot of different ways that you speak about that. One piece I want to read is you talk about reparations, and you define it in a really holistic way. You say, in a legal sense, reparations usually involve monetary restitution for loss incurred through oppression. But reparations are more than money. They are also policies and measures enacted in the normal course of governing. Reparations are recognition of and accountability for wrongdoing. They are action by the offending family, community, or government to repair the relationship that has been broken and to restructure the way things work such that all stand on equal footing from the moment of redress forward. It's my new favorite definition of reparations because it's
Wow.
holistic, and that it captures that reparations are just about repair. So I want to
Yeah.
ask, how in the book are you talking about repair, whether that be reparations or not, but that idea of how can we repair what's been broken?
Yeah, I mean, let's think of it just very practically. There's no way for us to figure out a new way of living in the world, to live differently in the world, without first repairing
Mhm.
what this construct of race broke. We cannot just move forward without going back and fixing and dismantling the structures that created this racial hierarchy of human belonging that we call race. And so what it looks like is it looks like seeking the truth about what we have done, about the policies that were passed, about the ways that some of them have actually, they might have been, outlawed. Like for example, redlining was outlawed in the 1960s, and yet we still find the practice happening in 2014. A
Right.
bank was actually taken to court because they redlined in New York State. They were redlining as a normal part of practice. In fact, the whole 2008, 2009 economic downturn happened because banks had targeted people of color for subprime loans. So that's a whole nother way that, and these were people of color who were earning six figures,
Mhm.
and five-figure white people were getting prime loans. Six-figure Black people were getting subprime loans. And that is what caused the housing bubble to burst. That's what caused our economic downturn. So it looks like going back and actually seeking the truth about what we have done. It looks like listening to the truth from those it happened to. And it looks like then telling the truth to those who need to know around us who may not have heard the first time around.
Mhm.
Then it looks like going to those to whom the oppression was done. And like David does in 2 Samuel 21, 1 through 14, asking them, what do you say we must do in order for things to be made well with you? You see, David, for me, the thing that has been the most important thing about reparations that it's not who gets the check, it's not how the check is or whether it's a check, it's the process, because the most fundamental thing that needs to be repaired is the relationship. The relationship broke because of the process of how things were established on this land. The moment that that first explorer landed on the coast of a nation in Africa and looked at the people and said, "You you are not civilized, and therefore I have the right to claim your land for the throne and enslave your people," according to the doctrine of discovery, which of course was the edict of Pope Nicholas V in 1453, 1554, 1555. What you see is you see that that moment was the moment it broke,
Mhm.
because at that moment they failed to see the image of God in the other. They failed to see the call of God for that human being to exercise dominion in the world, and they claimed that right exclusively for themselves. It's that is the moment that has to turn first, the right of dominion. So what David did in that moment was David actually gave the Gibeonites dominion over this moment. David said, what do you say we need to do in order for things to be made well with you? And they had already had their council meeting. They knew. And they told him, and it was costly. It
Mhm.
was not an eye for an eye, though, but it was costly. And David did it without asking even one question.
Yeah.
And how did God
Yeah.
respond? God lifted the drought that had been plaguing them.
Mhm.
So our process has to be a process that repairs the relationship between people of African descent and those of European descent and our government. It has to be a process that acknowledges and bows to the image of God in us, in
Mm.
people of African descent, and recognizes our divine call to exercise dominion even over this moment. So it looks like going to the Black Manifesto and re-examining it from early 1970s, late 1960s. It looks like examining the and taking seriously the vision of repair that the movement for Black lives has drawn for us, has sketched for us over the last 5 to 7 years. It looks like taking a serious look at HR 40, the House resolution that is named after the 40 acres and a mule that we never got. William Darity, economist, says if we ever did actually enact the 40 acres and a mule, if we had done that at the time, we actually would not need to be having the question of repair right now. We wouldn't need it, because we would have had wealth accumulation over generations. But we didn't do it. So now we have to do it. And then ultimately for us, for people of Europe, of African descent and others who have been subjugated, there must be, if we are to attain the beloved community, and if that is the goal, there must be some measure, some kind of forgiveness of the things that cannot ever be restored, that can never be repaired, the people who have died,
Mhm.
the communities that have been broken up and are not going to come back together. We need to let that go. And then let that go in terms of releasing white folk from the need to restore that which they cannot restore. And then we need to turn to God, and we need to say, God, you're the one who has cattle on 1,000 hills.
Mm.
White folk may not be able to ante up for this thing right here, but you can. You can move mountains. You can make it happen. All right, God, ante up.
You talk about how part of repair is forgiveness and how forgiveness is something that is really costly, yet it is also itself something that is reparative. It's bi-directional how it forms someone, right? It's a gift to the person you forgive. But can you say more about how that is something for the person who forgives, that is also a release? It's a change in identity, because you get very specific and personal with the impact that that had on you and your path to coming to see that forgiveness is something that's reparative for you as someone who forgives.
Yeah, forgiveness, I'm just very clear about this. Forgiveness is not for the sake of the oppressor. Forgiveness is for the sake of the oppressed. I was standing on the edge of the lime quarry on the island of Robben Island off the coast of Cape Town in South Africa. And we were pilgrimaging across the island that day in order to retrace the steps of Nelson Mandela, who lived on that island for 17 years, I believe, who he was exiled and imprisoned. And I learned that day that the lime quarry was a dehumanizing place. It was a place where they were forced to move rock, literally cut rock, the same rocks that were used to build the prison they were in. And they were going to cut that rock and then move it from the lime quarry to a place about a mile away on the other side of the island. And then the next day, they would pick up that same rock and move it all the way back. And that's not what work is supposed to be. Work is supposed to actually contribute to our flourishing. It's not supposed to be idle. It's not supposed to be for nothing. That's dehumanizing when work is idle or when there's no work at all. And so that lime quarry was a place of dehumanization. And it hit me as I was staring at that actually apartheid itself was a dehumanizing structure. It did not recognize the image of God, the inherent dignity, the humanity of people of African descent, of literally indigenous African descent, and also other people of color in apartheid South Africa. It was dehumanizing. It wasn't just oppressing. And so the anti apartheid movement was not just a movement against oppression, it was a movement against dehumanization.
Mm.
And that's the reason I believe that Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu called the nation to forgive, because forgiveness is a humanizing act.
Mhm.
Only a human can forgive. Only a human can
Mhm.
forgive. And the way that that Archbishop Desmond Tutu puts it, and the way that I actually come to understand it, is that there's a tie that is created, an unhealthy and a toxic tie that is created between oppressed and oppressor through the act of oppression. The act of exploitation ties me economically to that white person who is oppressing me and my family. I need them in order to survive, in order to do anything, because they're oppressing. They're only giving me a pince wage, a little pince day's wage, nothing of a day's wage in order for me to work. So now I'm dependent on them. In America, it looks like having a mostly white male run government and Black people saying, please give us our rights, right? Please give us what our land is worth,
Mhm.
even though we're citizens and therefore by law, we are entitled to this, but we have to beg. So forgiveness does something very profound. It says, I don't need you. I no longer need you. I release you.
My identity is not dependent on you.
My identity and my well-being
Mhm.
is no longer dependent on you. So you can go now. Now, go.
Almost an exorcism, just in the way you're
That's
speaking of
exactly what
this.
it is. That's
Mm.
exactly what it is.
Which
It's an
maybe you said in your
exorcism.
book. Maybe that's not my idea, but that's
I
that.
don't know. It might actually be. I don't know. I remember if I wrote that or not, but it's good. So if it's in there, great. If not, you can claim that. Here's the thing is that it's not saying we don't want relationship. What
Right.
it's saying is, look, I'm tired of demanding this from you and you taking your time to figure out if you're going to be human or not,
Mhm.
if you're going to be good or not, if you're going to
Mhm.
trust God or not. I release you. You no longer have to make that choice. I don't need you anymore. Now, what I'm doing is I'm turning to God and I'm saying, God, you do it.
Mhm.
Now, when I say, God, you do it, let me just say, it's much better for you if you decide that you're going to do it.
Hmm.
It's much better for you if you say, you know what? Yeah, no, 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 we'll do reparations. Don't worry. We're
Right.
going to do
Right.
this, right? Because if God does it, it's going to be judgment on your head.
Mm,
If God does it, it's going to be reparations and repair that is
mm,
outside of your will.
mhm,
But I think that
mhm,
part of it, what it is it's decentering the oppressor.
mhm,
It takes the oppressor out of the center of the universe and it
mhm,
puts God back into the center of the universe. That what God says is what goes. What
mm,
God can do is what can happen, not just what the oppressor is willing to do.
mhm. Yeah. Well, racism is a heresy, right? It is this effort to dethrone God and replace his supremacy. And so it is this recognition of the recentering of who he is.
That's right.
So at the Evangelical Network at EJUSA, we have a special place in our heart in thinking about the dehumanization through the death penalty. And so I wanted
Yes.
to ask about one very specific piece in your book. You connect the 4,084 lynchings of Black people to, quoting you, disparate applications of the death penalty to this day. So
Yes.
can you make that explicit connection of those things to the death penalty in the modern day?
Yeah. I mean, look, the death penalty, one thing that really struck me when you look at lynchings in America, lynchings meaning extrajudicial executions, right? So executions that happen without a judge or a court. Nearly 5,000 extrajudicial executions happened in the Jim Crow era alone. And that was between 1877 and 1950. That's they what they do is they count it up to Brown versus the Board of Education, basically up to 1954. And what you have there is you actually have people of European descent engaging with people of African descent as if we are criminals, inherently criminals. That's how you get 5,000 lynchings. When I thought about it, I thought, wow, this is kind of deep. For about 246 years, people of European descent have lived in a society where people of African descent have been treated in the same way that criminals are treated in Europe. We were in work farms. That was the prison structure in Europe. We had overseers. That was a prison structure in Europe. We were confined in small places in either slave cabins or given no cabin at all, made to sleep in the fields more often than not. That was a prison structure in Europe. We were executed, and especially in the Jim Crow era, executed without trial um, on by being hung. We called it lynching here. That was a prison structure in Europe, and yet our only crime was to be born Black. That was it. That was the crime. And it was not a crime. It was simply, it was the way that white people interacted with us was as if we are inherently criminal. Well, it's that implicit bias, that unconscious bias that was kind of baked into the white imagination of Blackness over the course of nearly 300 years that now works itself out in the legal systems and structures. So that what you have with the death penalty is you have basically a holdover from lynching. I think this is really, really well illustrated um, in the book by my interaction with one man who was on death row for 30 years and was set free by the work of EJI, Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. And what you saw was the day that he was picked up by the police, you saw that he was told by the police officer, he asked the police, "What am I being picked up for? I didn't do anything." He said, "It doesn't matter if you did anything." He said, "I know you're going to be convicted, and here's how. We're going to get a white man, a white police, a white witness to say you did it. The jury will be all white. The judge will be white. You know what that all spells?" He said, and he spelled the word conviction. And he was convicted,
Mhm.
like literally in I think less than a day. They came back with a judgment, and he was convicted and put on death row. And he lived on death row in isolation for 30 years until EJI came around and fought for 20 of those years to set him free, and set him free in 2000 and I believe 16. And so, no, 15, 2015. So it's that practice of our justice system that privileges money and privileges whiteness in the application of the law now, that has made it such that the death penalty is handed down, meted out to people of African descent more than to anyone else. And that's a holdover from the lynching, from the era of lynching.
Mhm.
And those same people are put in prisons and made to work for pennies, just like our ancestors were, um, in peonage, in modern day peonage, which we now call convict leasing. So organizations, businesses like Victoria's Secret and Whole Foods used to, until they were called out on it, leveraged convict leasing in order to have cheap labor done in America. Most of our office furniture, like mass office furniture, is produced by convict leased labor. What does that mean? It means Black men mostly. 1 in 3 Black men are interacting with the prison system in the course of their lifetimes. And most of them, many of them, will have interaction with being exploited for their labor while in prison because of the loophole in our 13th Amendment. So, without trying to give a whole class on this in about a minute, I just, for me, the question of the death penalty is really the most emphatic example
Mhm.
of slavocracy that is still happening in America.
Mhm. Mhm. I want to give some space for those that are attending to ask some questions, and you all can put any of those in the chat, and I'll give a minute or so for those to come up, and then Lisa will pull some of those. So while people are thinking, and as we move towards wrapping up, let's talk about Black Fortune Month, what that is, and advocacy, and how people can get involved. And can you start with just a brief piece, as you said, it could be a whole class. How would you build a theology of advocacy, and then how can people advocate?
Well, a theology of advocacy simply understands that the image of God is in every single human being. And that doesn't just mean that, we are worthy of dignity. That is fundamental to the meaning of that. But in the text itself, what it means is that we are called to exercise dominion in the world. We are called to exercise agency, to make decisions that impact the world. We are called to protect the rest of the world. We are called to serve the rest of the world. So, in our service and our protection, we advocate. We stand with images of God that are under threat. We stand with and protect images of God that are being threatened by the kingdoms of men that are hell bent on crushing the image of God on earth. And that's how I understand this theologically. I go back to, I look at Luke 1. Luke 1 begins in the days of King Herod, in the days of a despot who would kill his own family in order to maintain power. In those days, the king of the kingdom of God was born, crossed time and space and entered the world. And I believe in order to confront the kingdoms of men that were crushing the image of God on earth. And here's the thing, the way the ancients understood the image of God and the image of the king is that the image of the king was a marker of where the king rules. And the health of that image was an indicator of the health of the kingdom. Where there were flourishing and abundant images of that king, you actually knew that this was a flourishing kingdom. Where there were crushed, melted down, pulverized, or neglected images of the king or the queen, you knew that there was war happening against that kingdom in the land. So when we govern and legislate and craft the way that we live together in ways that cover over or bury or eliminate or ignore, fail to recognize the image of God in our neighbors, in all of our neighbors, their call to exercise agency in the world.
Mhm.
We do that through oppression, and we do that through poverty, entrenched poverty. What we're actually doing is we are announcing to God that we declare war against God. That's how I believe that's how God sees it.
Mhm.
And I
Mhm.
think the text makes that clear. And I think that's why Jesus came again. That's why Jesus came, actually, is to set free the image of God on earth. And so what does it look like then for us to exercise co-dominion with God? What does it look like for us to partner with God in the protection of the image of God on earth? It looks like advocacy. It looks like standing with those who are having the image of God crushed within them. It looks like standing with those whose votes are being subverted and are being suppressed. It looks like calling on our democratically elected officials who we put in office to listen to our voices and listen to what we say needs to happen in our nation, which is the protection of the image of God within our nation. First and fundamentally through the vote, but also through truth telling and through repair.
So it's Black History Month, but not really for Lisa Sharon Harper, because it's Black Fortune Month. So how have you revisioned this and engaged this in a different way around all these themes that you're talking about?
Right. Well, we just so happen to be in a month, not only Black History Month, but a month where the appropriations budget is going through Congress. We have a window of opportunity, actually, to call on Congress to tell the truth about who we are and how we got here, to mount a truth commission so that we can really find out who we are and how we got here. We can call on Congress to take seriously HR 40, take seriously the call to repair what race broke in the world. And we can learn ourselves. We can go deep and we can prepare for the push to save democracy in our nation. So people around the globe right now are reading Fortune, reading about this history, trying to figure out how do their families intersect with this history that I've outlined through the framework of my own family story. They are also discussing it in their own small groups, in their own book studies, or by checking into the events that are happening nearly daily throughout the month. Events are happening somewhere online where people are doing this kind of a thing, gathering their people together in order to talk about what they're learning in the book Fortune. And then finally, in our National Black Fortune Day of Advocacy and Action, which will be happening on February 28th, we're going to do a massive national call-in day to call our Congress to repair what race broke in the world and then to tell the truth about it. And on the 1st of March, leaders who have been our partners in this effort of Black Fortune Month will be flying into Washington, D.C. to talk with the leaders on the Hill who are pushing for truth telling and repair.
So
you
this
can be
is
a part
really,
of it. Join us.
yeah, this is a really practical way, right? This is something people can participate in bodily there in DC. This is something people can participate in wherever they are by engaging this book. The National Call-in Day is something that you can do from home. So there's a host of ways to access these. So where can people hear more about this? And also know, someone was asking about the recording. We'll send out the recording of this. We'll send the link to Lisa's site, but where can people find out how to engage in this?
Well, before I do that, I know we only have 3 minutes, but I want to answer this really great question by Andrea Ball. So Andrea, you asked a question about how the clergy has played a perpetuating role in slavery and punitive aspects of the criminal justice system. I'll just say that this is in the book, but from the very beginning of the very first race laws, I think I said earlier that the first race law in Maryland said that white women would need to be enslaved to their husbands' masters if they married an enslaved Black man, and their children would be enslaved in perpetuity. Well, they looked up a few years later and they realized that now planters are forcing their indentured Irish and indentured Ulster Scots women to marry enslaved Black men and have children by these men so that they would then benefit economically from the free labor they would get in perpetuity. So the Maryland legislature, which was Catholic at the time, they said, "Ooh, we didn't expect that." They clutched their pearls and they changed who had the right then to manage, to determine who would be enslaved and who would be indentured. They took that power out of the hands of the planters and placed that power into the hands of the church. So the church then, mainly the Episcopal Church, but not only the Anglican and Episcopal Church, but it then also became the Catholic Church and other churches throughout the colonies became the arbiters, the ones who managed who got enslaved and who got who got indentured through the colonial era. And then when we pass into the post-revolutionary era, when we become the United States of America, it is the church that then develops theology that entrenches slaveocracy throughout the South. And it is the church that has, unfortunately, not the whole church, but major swaths of the church that have been proponents of the death penalty in America. And it's the same parts of the church that were also proponents of lynching. Do you realize that we have never, to this day in American history, passed an anti-lynching law? Why? Because the Southern church and also Southern legislators have blocked anti-lynching laws to this day.
Mhm.
So how can you keep this conversation going? Follow us at fortunebook.us or blackfortunemonth.com. Both of them are connected, so you'll be able to reach either one through the other. And you can always follow me on social media, on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. And also, hey, Freedom Road, we are a consulting group that exists to shrink that narrative gap. So please, check us out at freedomroad.us.
Lisa, thank you. So a few have asked, we have recorded it. We'll send out the recording to everybody who's here and to anybody who's registered with this. So this has been Lisa on In the Movement. So we're a webinar series. Lisa, you're our inaugural person who's come on, and what our hope is to engage and elevate voices of people who are in the movement. So we will send out all of that info. And thank you so much for coming on here, Lisa. We will pray for you. Blessings on you as you continue this month. Last time we talked, you said everything was buzzing for you in a good way. And so I hope that leads to great fruit in your labor. So again, thank you so much for coming on here.
Really appreciate this. Appreciate you, appreciate your community, and look forward to interfacing with you more.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. And thank you to everybody for joining. Bye-bye.